Right, in this episode, I need to get all the core body components aligned so that I can add the supports for the cab and the rollover protection. Because this has only been in a mock-up form until now, but now I need to make sure that everything is a little bit more symmetrical so that the final result comes out kind of nice. First step we need to do is start cutting out stuff that we don't need. So I began using a bandsaw to remove any unneeded material from the Ertl 988 body, this deck that you could see here at the top, and created some score lines where I thought the metal was going to break, but didn't quite go the way that I expected, so I finished it off with a pair of square-nosed pliers. Before any cab mounts could be attached to this frame, I needed to make sure all of it was level. So I started with some very ineffective filing, followed by some very effective sanding. I ended up attaching the power for the sander to a pedal, which gave me a lot of control over when the belt was running and when the belt wasn't running, so that I wouldn't destroy my piece. I then hit it again with the file to make sure everything was nice and level. Alright, now that I've figured out how I want this positioned, I no longer need this base plate for the old counterweight. So I've created a new one out of brass that's going to get attached to the brass frame that's already done. And just to give you a comparison of how much bigger the counterweight for the F is compared to the B, just gives you a little bit of perspective. And then it will get soldered onto the bottom of here. This little piece of brass is just a spacer that's glued on temporarily just to help me level it out, but don't need it anymore. One of these days, Stephen will learn that files are not as effective as sanders when it comes to removing material. I decided to hook my disc sander up to the pedal as well to give me that good control over when it's on and when it's off, because I needed to remove some more material from the bottom of the frame to get a nice contact for soldering. Before soldering, it's always a good idea to rough up the surface. Here I'm using sandpaper, and as you can see, I taped off the areas that I didn't want to sand. This was pre-measured and allowed me to line up the part that I was going to solder with much greater ease. And after you sand, always try to clean off the surface. Here I'm using rubbing alcohol to get any grease and ink off, and then applying a flux and solder paste to the surface. Soldering this new rear plate on proved to be a bit of a challenge due to the thickness of the metal that I was trying to solder. That was compounded by the fact that I was using heavier clamps which were absorbing all the heat that I needed to go to the parts that I was soldering. Though I did get a little bit of a superficial solder here on the top, it wasn't enough to keep stuff stuck together. So I removed the clamp that was holding the plate to the frame and replaced it with some trusty old alligator clips. The drawback of the alligator clips is they don't have the holding power that the clamps do, but they also don't absorb as much heat, which enabled me to finally get the heat where I needed it and got a good bond. Before making the cab mount parts, I needed to remove a little bit more material from the 988B donor model, specifically in the area of the deck. This allowed me an opportunity to put the two components together, that being the brass frame and the body, to visualize where the parts were going to go and how big they needed to be. And in a rare example of me thinking ahead, I decided to create the forward mounts out of two pieces of brass that I'd simply be able to solder together, sort of like a sandwich. Sandwiches. The alternative to this would have been creating it out of three pieces, one being the bottom piece, two being the middle piece, and three being the top piece, which would have been pretty difficult, much like trying to solder two really small pieces of brass perpendicularly to one really small piece of brass. My original intention was to glue these mounts to the frame because I was afraid that I'd mess up the soldering that I already did, but it's kind of the point of a resistant soldering iron, is to solder stuff without messing up the work that you've already done, and it worked like a charm. Had I thought of this earlier, I would have saved myself from having to drill the holes in the mounts twice, but hey, You learn by doing. My favorite technique for creating bolts is to take a small gauge brass rod, dip it in super glue, and then with a pair of pliers insert it into the hole. Be sure to not apply too much pressure or you'll bend the rod, and not in that cool fishing sort of way either. Then finish it off with a pair of flat edge cutters. You can use a file to even up the tops if you find one that's too long. The thickest brass that I have is 3.3 millimeters, which means to make the rear mounts, I would have to stack multiple pieces together like Legos. The idea was that I would solder this tower of bad decisions to the frame and everything would work out wonderful. But that didn't happen. The top two blocks are actually keyed to click together, but being a CNC amateur, I'm still struggling with two-sided machining, especially at this scale. So the bottom and middle blocks had to be soldered smooth side together, which was a real challenge to hold in place. I tried various ways to attach the failed stack to the frame, but could never really get it all aligned, partially due to that poor fitting bottom key. I tried various attempts, but they all looked pretty sloppy. So I created a new set of lower blocks that held to the frame much tighter and more accurately. This time around, I soldered the lower blocks to the frame first. This enabled me to line up the already joined top pieces to it with greater ease. Now I didn't have to solder as tall of a stack and was able to keep everything aligned. The results were much better.
And here it is with the front and rear cab and rollover protection support mounts installed. And the way this would work, I have this base piece here, which would install that way, and then the cab would get glued down on there. And then the rest of this would fit in around here. There's still more trimming I need to do on this to get it to fit flush, which I will do before the next episode, but that will do it for this one. As always with all my episodes, I like to try to have takeaways or lessons learned, and I think the biggest one from this episode would be planning things ahead a little bit better, having a more realistic idea of what my expectations are for a build, and then planning a little bit more in the beginning. Had I realized that I didn't want to use the not so great cab that came with this, I would have been able to foresee that this would have needed to have been part of the original cutout for the side of the frame, and it would have saved me from having to do this sort of Lego block type of build-up to make this rear mount, and it would have made it a lot stronger and taken a lot less time, because it took probably a day to design this, cut it out, and then tinker around with the soldering to get it all lined up. The likelihood of me actually attaching this to here for like the final assembly is pretty slim. I don't think I'd get a good attachment to it. I'd have to drill holes in here and then install pins. So what I might do instead is a little bit of behind the scenes tomfoolery, and I'll have a plate that won't be visible running across the bottom of here that will hold this in place. So it'll look like these two things are attached, but they won't really be, for the sake of keeping everything level. But I'll get to that part when I get to it. The next episode, I'm going to make the rollover protection, and that's what these little insets are for. I hope to be able to have it come down and glue into here, because I need to have, for my order of assembly, the ability to glue stuff in place. And also, I want a couple weak points in here that aren't soldered. So if I maybe accidentally drop the model or hit the top of it too hard, I would rather a super glued point like that break than something that's soldered. Though with how tall and skinny these are, the solder's probably going to break anyways. But just a little bit of insurance. And that wraps it up for this episode, guys. As always, adios, and I will see you on the next one.